Peter Earls and welcome them to our meeting this morning. As always, I want to open it up to Attorney General Stein and Justice Earls if they have any advice or direction for us today.
None for me, Secretary Hooks. Just pleasure to be with everybody and grateful for everyone's efforts.
Likewise, I just want to thank everyone for all your hard work and glad to be here this morning.
Well, thank you both, and thank you for your leadership, and thank you for all of the hard work that's gone into getting these meetings together. It's not lost on me with our substantive staff leads that have really put a lot of work and have brought guest speakers and information to us so that we can educate ourselves and converse with one another as we move forward in our pathway to improve racial equity in criminal justice. We're going to jump right in today and review the revised recommendations on diversion and reinventing public safety. And so with that, I would like to turn it over to Greg and to Jeff to the degree if you are able to post those, the revised recommendations on the screen, Greg. And then Jeff, I'll open it up to you to hit any of the highlights.
Okay, thank you. And sorry, let me get my video going here. So based on the conversation that we had last time, Greg and I went back and took another look at these draft recommendations. The first one regarding diversion also wound up getting a lot of input from the staff for the task force as a whole, and became the subject of a meeting between task force staff and some folks from DHHS who have been working on funding nascent diversion programs across the state. So that first recommendation regarding diversion saw a pretty significant amount of change based on the input from all those different stakeholders. You can see that it incorporates some of the feedback from last time regarding, hey, this shouldn't be law enforcement's lift by itself. It's changed the main actor to local governments, including a partnership between law enforcement service providers and directly impacted people. Contains some of the language that it did previously about LEAD being an example upon which progress could be built. And then there's some racial equity language included there towards the latter part of the recommendation. And I would note specifically that some of the folks at DHHS who've been working on funding diversion programs across the state identified some of these points as points that were important to include, including data collection that includes race and ethnicity, comparing participation rates to people who were eligible for the program and so forth. They may provide more detailed information to us about race-related metrics to collect, but we incorporated here the information that they did provide. So the one other thing that I'll note about this recommendation is that Working Group 3 has also been working on a diversion-related recommendation. Working Group 3 is focused in general on the court phase of the criminal justice system, and they have a recommendation that they've approved on that initially was focused on post-arrest diversion, but kind of expanded to include some suggestion that pre-arrest diversion also be used. So I just note that there's a little bit of overlap between what they're recommending and what this working group has taken a look at. But that's the journey that this recommendation went on since our last meeting, and I'm happy to leave it there for discussion or mention what happened with regard to the reinventing public safety recommendations. Secretary Hooks, which would you prefer?
While we have you up, why don't we go ahead and have you touch on the reinventing public safety recommendations for the good of the group, and maybe they can ponder a little bit of that when we come back.
Sure thing. And those saw less change. There wasn't candidly quite as much request for change on those coming out of the meeting. So there's two recommendations there. The first one looks almost identical to what the group saw last time. You can see the only change is down in 1B and 1C. We took out non-911 based on a recognition that sometimes calls come in through 911 that may be appropriate for response by folks other than law enforcement agencies or law enforcement officers. And then we added a suggestion that ideally officers who respond, if there's a co-responder model or a CIT model, be officers who specialize in crisis intervention. And that was after some discussion with folks at DHHS about CIT training and how it works. Some of those folks made the point that even if every officer gets CIT training and has some baseline level of skill, there still are going to be some officers who are better than others at that and who express more interest in that and who continue to pursue crisis intervention as a passion. And ideally, if those officers exist, we thought agencies ought to leverage them. So we included that. And then there's a note there that Chief Letney had suggested that we amend the recommendation to suggest that agencies participate in the IACP One Mind campaign, which certainly looks like it's in the same general direction, but we just weren't sure whether the group would want to endorse kind of pointing to an outside group in that way. So we just teed that up for further discussion. And then item 2 is relating to universal CIT training. And there, Chief Letney suggested the simplest way to do that is just to incorporate it into BLET. So we revised the recommendation to reflect that. So I think all in all, relatively small potatoes changes to these compared to the diversion recommendation, but that's what we did based on the group's conversation last time and the kind of staff background work that we did in between meetings. Just emphasize, I think, what Secretary Hooks already set the table for, which is the group ought to discuss these and make any changes that it wants to make, and we're happy to carry those out. And then the goal would be to have a final form out to the group for electronic voting after this meeting. So hopefully we'll get these across the finish line between this meeting and the next.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. And it's evident from just your disclosures of the networking that you all have done. There's been a lot of hard work behind the scenes that goes into bringing the concepts and the discussions to life to move racial equities and criminal justice forward in a very positive way. I'd like to give the opportunity to come back to the first draft recommendation concerning diversion. And would like to give the opportunity to our working group members to weigh in on any of the areas, both positive or if there's any area of concern or that's not quite clear to you, we'd like to entertain those thoughts at this time. So let me start with Sheriff Clemens. Do you have any thoughts concerning the draft recommendations as you see them listed here, sir?
Good morning, Secretary Hooks. They look good as written. No comment.
Thank you, sir. I'm gonna kind of poll the group. Mr. Wells? Mr. Wells, I think you're still on mute.
I'm supposed to be able to push all day, but I kept doing it and it wasn't working, so I apologize. On the diversion, I do have some comments on the other ones, so should I just hold off on those?
Yes, sir, we'll come back to those.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Mr. Pittman.
Yes, particularly dealing with the diversion piece. We know and understand from last time that it will be some law enforcement agencies will not buy into the particular lead model, and so I wanted to see some type of incentive put in there or some type of mechanism put in there to make them buy into it. I don't know if we incentivize it or we do something to where we, it is some type of penalty for not, but I suggest we incentivize it. But it should be some type of incentive in place for them to partake in this, and I don't see none.
Thank you, sir. Is it your thought that the state should offer some type of incentive to participate in that? So we kind of flesh out that thought.
Yes, that's my thought. The state should offer some kind of incentive for them to participate in it.
All right. Ms. Maxwell?
Good morning, Secretary Hooks and Working Group. My concern is that when we go to diversion, how can we ensure, Mr. Pittman said, incentivize that agencies that have been used to using arrest as a procedure go to using diversion as a procedure because it has been ingrained. We might have to offer examples of alternatives down the road through whatever training through BLET and things, because that has been the culture and mindset to arrest. And now we're saying divert and don't send them to other resources. That's just my concern. Otherwise, I like it.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Chief, not necessarily directly in response to Ms. Maxwell's, but to bring up her point, how do we redirect law enforcement mindset to diversion versus the charging concept?
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. I think what we have seen in other communities that have instituted a diversion program is that it is an option. It is not the only option. Just like arrest is an option and it's not the only option. So it depends on circumstances and it depends on what services are available, what case is most appropriate for diversion versus some other type of closure. We also have to keep in mind in many of these cases, not all, but in many, there are victims. And we can't lose sight of the victim's needs and issues and desires. And that has to be part of the criminal justice system. So I agree that incentives are a good thing. I would not support penalties just because of the sheer nature of what this is. It has to be something that an agency understands. There are wraparound services available and that is a viable option in that particular community. So to that extent, I appreciate staff's work on all of this. It looks very good. I have two minor comments. The first is where it says local governments in partnership with law enforcement. Great, puts the kind of the impetus on the local government to be the organizing group rather than law enforcement, which as you know, I think is right. I would like to maybe clarify that a little bit, or at least maybe have some commentary that probably these type of programs should be at a minimum based at the county level, because we're talking about prosecutors, which are generally county or district level. But to expect every one of our 500 and some odd law enforcement agencies across the state to be able to have a program, or actually I should say, every one of our local governments, cities and counties to be able to do that might be unrealistic. Where if there's a collaborative approach, and this is done at the county level, or even beyond that, if the prosecutorial district is wider than one county, which many of them are, as we know, maybe that's the way it goes. Because when diversion and law enforcement collaborate with prosecutors, then there may be better outcomes and outcomes that are more consistent across the board. So that's the first comment. Second comment, and I'm not sure it's really appropriate for this recommendation, but just a comment relating to the note in work group 3's work further down, which talks about law enforcement diverting or not arresting even in felony cases. And well, I think there's a place and a time for that. I think there needs to be some criteria. My concern with that is now you are putting the responsibility and to some extent the burden on law enforcement to choose what cases get diverted and what cases do not. And that may have an unintended consequence of widening that racial gap. It may not. It's just my thought in reading this is that something that comes to mind. So the incentives, I think, could be working around maybe some grant funding to stand up a program, to hire staff to develop a program within a local government or a law enforcement agency representative or prosecutorial office. It could be training based. It could be either chief executive training, senior command staff training, or maybe this eventually gets right into BLET. So we are changing that culture, as Ms. Maxwell talks about, that officers are often taught the solution is to arrest, which in some cases it is, in some cases it isn't. So to change that mindset, we'll have to change a culture, and that starts from basic training.
Thank you, Chief. I would ask our staff leads to also let's engage the Conference of District Attorneys concerning this as an organization, because you will need buy-in for diversion, because they would have to sign off on these decisions that are made by officers in real time and support those so that they can overcome any thought process that's either adding to racial bias about what's enforced, what's not enforced, and then also for the officers so that it can kind of alleviate some specter of that they have been involved in some corruption, because some people get arrested, some people don't. And so I'd like to open it up to Ms. Angelica Wynn for your thoughts. You've heard what's been out there and the comments concerning victims, as well as opportunities for people to not become defendants. I'd like to hear from you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Yes, I believe that the victim voice is important, and I think, but part of that is from my experience with working with victims for over a long time, is that oftentimes what victims say is that they just don't want the crime to happen to anyone else. And sometimes we have victims who say, yes, I want to see this person incarcerated, but oftentimes what we find is that they just don't want someone else to be re-victimized, and they want to see a shift and a change. And I don't believe that incarceration is necessarily the answer to shift and change someone's behavior. And again, I think you have mentioned it before, Chief Hooks, as the Secretary Hooks, about being an option. And I think it's important for us to be able to have different options for law enforcement officers that don't necessarily lead up to arrest and incarceration. And part of it is going to be a huge culture shift, which is why I appreciate Mrs. Maxwell's comment about how we need to start from the beginning with the BLET portion of it, because those folks are going to be let out into the world as police officers with a different perspective, understanding that you use different tools for different situations. And what I like about the incentivizing is that it also helps shift the culture of the folks who have already graduated and are already doing the work. And that can provide some sustainability. In terms of penalizing, I don't know if you necessarily get a lot of folks on board when you penalize. So I'm definitely more pro the incentivizing participation in programs like these.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it. Sergeant Garton, as a trainer and practitioner, I'd like to round this discussion out with some of your thoughts concerning the draft recommendations as presented, and maybe as you've incorporated the discussion here.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. As I look at the drafts as they're presented, I don't see any glaring issues. I would just like to remind and maybe make the statement that when we think about law enforcement as a whole, it is just not the police officer itself. This diversion culture change and mindset needs to be listed at every level of law enforcement and criminal justice system, to include all the way from the arrest all the way to sentencing. There should be an avenue for diversion should someone meet the criteria for it. Being not too far removed from the streets, sometimes it's a little much to ask a law enforcement officer who may have been assaulted or something like that to think about diversion, or who has seen the effect on the victim in that moment. So you have these emotions attached with the charging at that time. And so maybe asking a law enforcement officer at that very moment to start thinking about diversion may be a much greater task than we're looking at. But if there's an avenue for that diversion to take place at the district attorney's level at the court, first setting, second setting, things like that, all the way up to sentencing, then I think you have a program that's really fair and equitable throughout the whole process. And so that would just be my comments, that we look at this as a holistic approach and not just at the beginning, at the charging, at the law enforcement standpoint.
Secretary Hooks.
Appreciate that. Yes,
Secretary Hooks.
yes, I was certainly, Mr. Wells.
And I apologize. I do have everyone's comments have made me think of something that's come up with in a lot of my discussions, and it's sort of a whole topic within diversion or subtopic, and that's juvenile diversion. That I sort of think of as being in Representative Maury's working group as much as ours, but also fits within the school justice partnerships. But I do think that is an area that I hope somebody's exploring. So I don't know, Attorney General Stein, if that's the other working group, but it is something that I think is obviously an important part of this discussion. But one thing that I've heard over and over again is that when the state did raise the age, that there was a need for implementation funding and for funding for services. And that folks, a lot of stakeholders have felt like not all of that funding came to fruition. And so I think some of that funding, I don't know exactly that it fits in diversion, but it sort of fits in diversion, sort of fits in juvenile justice, sort of fits in prevention. But it is something that I heard repeatedly, and I just wanted to mention because it seemed to fit here as much as anywhere else.
Yes, sir. I think that is very appropriate with the raised age legislation. Our Division of Juvenile Justice continues to work hard. And one of the things we talked about earlier on in one of the meetings was the concerns about the numbers of school-based referrals into juvenile justice. Well, one of the things that we're fortunate with Billy Lassiter at the helm of juvenile justice is that he is the gatekeeper, not to keep people in, but to keep kids out. And so we are looking constantly for those off-ramps for kids to be diverted as far as juveniles, and particularly with raised the age. There are additional opportunities and challenges and funding is the most of those challenges, because we've seen a greater will all across the state to better equip our kids and not disadvantage them, with acts that they may conduct because they're kids. And in addition to that, I would like to try to either drag Attorney General Stein and Justice Earls a little bit into the conversation. We've talked somewhat about off-ramps. I know that there's some other working groups that are addressing that too. And so if between you all or Jeff or Jasmine's on here too, if you could shed some light into some of that other work, because I agree it goes beyond just the law enforcement providing the diversion and off-ramps for charges.
So Secretary Hicks, this is Anita. If I could jump in here. And I will say first that on the point of making sure that juvenile diversion is something that work group 3 looks at, I will definitely, they're meeting tomorrow at 4 o'clock. And I know that juvenile justice is the topic for tomorrow. So I'll make sure that that's a really good point. I'm glad you raised that. The other point I wanted to make before I talk about what other groups are looking at is that on this question of incentivizing, and I had also been thinking about how do we make this recommendation have more force, because we can say what we think would be nice, but actually implementing it and making it happen is a whole other task. And so I'm just curious, and there might be a good reason for this that I'm not aware of, or that you've already discussed it in some other forum and I don't know about it, but couldn't this task force recommend to the legislature that they create a program to fund these programs across the state? And because it seems like we're putting all the burden and the responsibility on the local or county governments, and ultimately I'm guessing that data will show what a huge cost savings this is when people are diverted from the criminal justice system. And there might even be a way to quantify that to help justify why the legislature should fund this. But that's the thought that came to me as to how to make this whole recommendation stronger, is to suggest that the legislature take action to support these programs. So I don't know, and maybe staff is better equipped to address the other questions that Secretary Hooks had.
I can give just a thought on both what Kerwin was talking about and what you were talking about. I think we were thinking about somewhat as implementation strategies and hadn't yet gotten to that in trying to flesh out the solution. So I think that a legislative implementation strategy around this could still very much be on the table.
This is Josh. These programs really don't cost much money. It's just, these are cops who are already on the beat, and they're engaging with somebody, and either they make an arrest or they make a referral to some existing program. And really where the cost, in my experience with them, where the cost isn't within law enforcement, it's the scarcity of suitable social services to make the referral, that there just are not enough drug treatment places or halfway houses or whatever is needed for the person. So yeah, I don't know what kind of financial incentive it is. It's more, you just need to have a network of allied social service organizations to partner with the local law enforcement. And to build on Sergeant Garton said, I mean, diversion can happen at every stage of the process. And I think that the ones who are looking at the courts, they're looking at diversion there with drug treatment court and other specialty courts. And y'all's task is that initial law enforcement citizen interaction. So I think it's appropriate for y'all to consider diversion at this stage, recognizing that diversion will also happen at other stages in the criminal justice process. And then the third thing I would say is that maybe we should mention more than just LEAD, because LEAD is one model of diversion. There's also the HOPE initiative, which was in the town of Nashville. There's the CORE program, which Sheriff Blackwood has in Orange County. And the other two require less initiative by law enforcement, and it's more just receipt of people. Like the way the HOPE program worked was anyone who had drug issues could walk through the door of the Nashville Police Department, bring whatever drugs and paraphernalia they had, hand it over with no criminal liability, and then be referred to some treatment facility. So it was more of a welcome sign than it was doing anything to change the way law enforcement engage with people out on the street. So I would consider adding to this recommendation other models, because LEAD is just but one model. And frankly, I think that if you look at the experience of LEAD compared to the experience of HOPE initiative touched many, many more lives than I think in just the town of Nashville than LEAD has statewide. But my data may be wrong on that.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Let me turn back to Jeff and to Greg. We have certainly gone around the room to let individuals have voice to the issues that we are addressing in that. Do you have any clarifying questions that you might need to kind of come back and tie this down a little bit more for us?
At least for me, I think I'm hearing kind of a will of the group to get a little bit further into the weeds of how to incentivize participation, perhaps through some sort of funding stream or grant funding, and making sure that training's available for agencies and communities that want to do it. So we can incorporate that into the recommendation. I guess the question that I have is how far we want to go into specifying an implementation strategy. I know that Justice Earls had suggested well, we could propose some legislative funding, and then Jasmine kind of noted that, yeah, some of the implementation strategies might be figured out later. So I'm trying to get some direction on the question of how far should we go in trying to pinpoint an implementation strategy versus how much should we save that for later.
I'll defer to some later discussions with you and Jasmine and the AG concerning that, but I generally would welcome a kind of a broad recommendation that pursue legislative funding to assist that. And then also I welcome you to do the same with the Governor's Crime Commission, where I certainly can have some direct impact on at least having them to look at it. And then make almost a co-recommendation up for legislative funding or the directing of grant funding that may come to communities. It doesn't have to go to law enforcement. It can be to those communities to make them more resilient and have a greater ability to facilitate diversion programs.
I just wanted to clarify that by later, I meant, now. That would be fine too.
All right, that sounds good. And anything I say that doesn't resonate as far as being able to do, or some of the direction that's been provided to us by the Attorney General, I'm in favor of at least putting it out there broadly, and then we can narrow it down, because any appropriation is going to be narrowed down and scoped. And then if we leave it somewhat broad for the Governor's Crime Commission, that gives at least the commission staff and the commissioners on that the leeway to kind of move it in different directions, and that may make funding more accessible. Excuse me.
I think we got it. We've got clarity, and we'll circle back with the task force staff as needed and bring something revised back to this working group for a vote.
All right. Thank you. All right. Well, I'm going to ask the working group, so that we can make good use of our time, that we're going to pivot to item number 3 on our agenda and look at the draft recommendations for community policing. Jeff has already done an outstanding job of bringing that to life for us and hitting the highlights. And so I do recall that Mr. Wells had some input that he wanted to offer concerning this recommendation.
Thank you. This definitely comes from my being the executive director of the Council on Developmental Disabilities. I would add just at the top, and maybe in the other areas too, propose adding autism and other developmental disabilities. There's a whole program that the Autism Society of North Carolina does that's very similar to CIT, that is specifically focused on autism, but also covers other developmental disabilities. And it is a significant need of the autism and developmental disability community for some segment of it, just like it is some segment of it within mental health and substance abuse, where there's behaviors related to autism, but also just different ways of interacting, different ways of communicating. And there's also a great training that happens in Alabama with law enforcement that grew out of a law enforcement father, a police officer who's was also a father of a child with autism, and just a real need there. And then one other thing, and I don't know if this fits, I'm always sort of expanding our scope a little bit, but what I've heard a lot is that CIT and the autism training is pretty saturated, and this state is doing just some really good work in that area. I do think for some folks, there's a need to dig a little bit deeper with like trauma and some other things. But that would be for a smaller segment, but where there's possibly more of a need, and certainly within the disability community, there's a thought that there's a need, is with judges and court personnel. And that raised a whole question for me, especially like bailiffs and others who are in court. But I certainly have a lot of experience where court personnel have reached out to me around just the fact that they're on the front lines, and that particularly folks with mental illness come to the courts, or mental health conditions, and that there's just a lot of need for understanding and of sort of what to do in those situations and how to handle them, and so they don't become law enforcement situations. And then the disability community also feels like there's a need with judges to just have more understanding both around mental health and autism. So those are my main sort of comments, which I know are a little bit further than what this has, but important information I've received just talking to the.
All right, thank you, sir. Chief, I believe you had a point, if my recollection serves, when you spoke earlier, that you wanted to make concerning reinventing public safety.
Yes, are we on, so we're on the second recommendation. Thank you. I appreciate the staff looking at suggestions from all of us and incorporating where that makes sense. I believe this this recommendation is good. The only thought I have is on 1C, where it says at a minimum dispatching of officers with crisis intervention training. I agree with ideally officers who specialize in crisis intervention. I think that's a great goal. I'm not sure it's realistic in most of our agencies across the state. While in larger departments, the Raleigh, Greensboro, Charlotte, those kind of things, they will probably have that. Most of our agencies are not that size and will not have those officers specially trained or those who see that as a passion as much. Let's hope they have that, but it won't be as much. And then if it is the case, then they may not be working. They may not be available. I go back to an officer I had a number of years ago who this was his passion. He was excellent at crisis intervention training. And anytime he was working and available, we would certainly have him go because he was just very, very good with helping people deal with that crisis. The problem is when you rely on that as your response, when that one or two or however many officers are not working, the other officers may not be as skilled because they revert to, well, officer so-and-so is working, I don't need to worry about that. So the balance across the state, I think, is important. And while I agree with the comment, I just wonder operationally how that would actually work.
Thank you, Chief. I appreciate it. Mr. Pittman, I see that we brought in, and it's been in there, some of the models that you brought to the working group's attention and led the discussions on. So I'd like to entertain your thoughts if we've accurately captioned that with respect to some models, knowing that there are other models and co-responder models out there, and any thoughts you have, sir.
Yeah, so I have a few thoughts surrounding this particular recommendations. The word, number one, the word communities kind of struck me as very, very broad. And so I didn't know if we wanted to specifically put different agencies within that, be it law enforcement and other cooperating partners with social workers and different things of that nature. It just struck me as broad, and it leaves rooms for other agencies to opt out and say, okay, well, this is not my field. I'm not part of that community. And as well as the CIT training for officers. And I know training is not kind of our field, but it kind of overlays with this particular recommendation. And so officers should be CIT trained. And so I don't know if we want to create, and I'm pretty sure another working group is creating, or I hope, let me say that, is creating some type of stream and process for every officer to be CIT trained, because we're dealing with individuals who are having crisis intervention situations, as well as this recommendation does not speak to the logistical part of how this will actually take place as far as funding part. So it doesn't speak to any type of funding stream, as well as no incentives again to kind of develop and adopt these new models and strategies and different things of that nature. Though it is good to add in the basic law enforcement training crisis intervention training and into the basic model, we have to think about the officers who are already officers, and be not only proactive but reactive in that regards, and getting these officers up to speed. And though I know it may be hard in some municipalities due to lack of funding, and so this is why I said earlier about the resources. As far as the One Mind campaign, it looks good to me. I propose we can adopt it as a whole nother recommendation, maybe recommendation 3, to be implemented on its own. It looks good. I looked into it somewhat, and I kind of like what I've seen. So as of right now, those are my only thoughts.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Maxwell, Mr. Pittman brought up the part concerning communities, and I'm not certainly not going to limit you to that, but does it also strike you that we may need to specify more who those are? And then I welcome your input overall on the recommendations.
Until he said it, Secretary Hooks, I did not realize that. As you know, I used to be part of our community child protection team, which specified which agencies would come, and still sometimes you had to drag them to the table. And also, as you know, with child fatality, everyone came willingly, but you had to do the prevention first, which was always hard to get cooperation. So maybe if we do specify, then you can piggyback whoever that municipality or community or county may be that's doing this, and say, well, you're on this list as part of the agencies to help us work or specify. Because for one thing, we have a lack of enough sufficient reentry programs, as Attorney General knows. We hold everybody in this region through, one program when we're talking about eliminating racial equity. We don't have enough expungement clinics for people who have been in the system. So I think the recommendations for CIT, everyone needs it. And if you say someone is specialized, I would say have someone who has CIT training or has been able to utilize it. That's just me. And when you do social workers, you're looking for licensed clinical social workers, or are you looking for a BSW? Because it just says social workers. And I like what Attorney General also mentioned about the program. I forgot the name of it, but I did look also, and it looks great. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Sergeant Garton, your thoughts?
I've just got more of a point of clarification, Mr. Secretary. When we refer to CIT training, and I think it's important that we make this distinction, because CIT, Crisis Intervention Training, is a model. And there's only one organization in the state right now that actually certifies that, and that's NAMI. And so if we're going to talk about CIT training as the model, that particular brand, that's going to put a lot on one agency or one organization to conduct the training for every law enforcement officer that goes through BLET program throughout the state. Also, it lends itself to them kind of directing that particular block of training. And so having gone through the training a number of times, I used to even help them conduct the training. And one of my staff members is probably top 3 or 4 officer throughout the state that helps them train other agencies, especially in this area. And I don't want to sound negative at all here. There is a lot in that 40 hours of instruction that really have very little to do with the law enforcement officer and the engagement. It's more so clinical understanding of different mental illnesses. And having spent some time talking with my staff member here, we've kind of understood it as this. And the way we look at it is, all that's great. And it's great if I can tell if you're bipolar or if you suffer from some other mental illness. But at the end of the day, the behavior lends itself to me understanding that you're suffering some type of crisis. And if you're suffering through some type of crisis, then I want to direct and kind of push my efforts to getting you the help that you need. It matters none to me what the particular name of your mental illness is. And so when we say CIT training, are we just talking about crisis training in general, or are we actually talking about the model? Because then we're actually going to give that organization a lot of control over how and what we do. And so there are other models out there that train in crisis. You know, there's even a one-day model being presented now that just talks about the meat and potatoes of crisis training for law enforcement. How do I show up, see that you're in crisis, and deal with you in crisis instead of trying to figure out if it's this particular mental illness or that particular mental illness. So we had to be very careful. If we just slap the word CIT on there, crisis intervention training, then that kind of puts it into one model, and that gives one organization a lot of control over this portion of it.
Sergeant Garden, I can take a stab at responding to some of that, because we did have a conversation with Trevor Allen and DHHS in detail about this. And that was the purpose, as Jeff said earlier, for that edit to C, where it says ideally officers who specialize in crisis intervention, because I think we're talking about two different things here. We're talking about the standard that all law enforcement through BLET, and then sounds like we might be adding back in, you know, existing officers have some type of crisis intervention training, little CIT training. But then also a best practice would be that law enforcement agencies have specialized training, more capital CIT units, or specialized like SWAT type training. And that is a special type of officer. That is an enhancement on what every officer should have. So there's a floor of training that people, and what DHHS told us is that a lot of that crisis intervention training is in BLET. It's being beefed up now as BLET is being revised. But what's not in BLET is that specialization that ideally would exist also within an agency. And so I'm uplifting what you're saying and saying that this is intended to be talking about two separate things. That there'll be a baseline of little CIT training for everybody, but specialization is something that people should have in an agency, ideally, understanding funding constraints and things like that. But that's what that is trying to make a distinction between.
All right, thank you. And I took the crisis intervention training to be generic in form, and I don't believe that it would be appropriate for us to adopt a model that identifies a company, so to speak. And so if we can kind of make sure that we flesh that out, I know that as state entities, and then that would be the same thing coming from, I don't imagine that the Governor's Crime Commission would put forward funding toward a specific company, but a concept of crisis intervention training as well, with potential pass-throughs of federal funding. And I don't believe it's a good practice for the legislature to ever identify a particular company when we have a competitive contracts philosophy for awarding contracts. So let me open it up to Ms. Angelica Wind. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so I really appreciate, and I'm glad to hear that that CIT is being beefed up in the BLET training curriculum. And I think I would echo the piece of ensuring that not only the officers that are in BLET training get the CIT training, or the generic or the little CIT, but I think it's important that the officers that are already out and about now also get it. And while I understand that each department is different and resources are different, I do think it is helpful to have officers who do specialize in crisis intervention programming, not only because they are going to serve as a resource to the community and their with regards to their specialty, but they are also able to support all the other officers who have received training. I equated a lot to our, because I work at a rape crisis agency, and I equated a lot to the way that we approach our work, in the sense that everybody gets crisis intervention training. So we're all capable of answering the call. if someone calls our crisis line or we have to go to the hospital. But there is a core group of folks that is their specialty. And so if we were ever to get a call that goes above and beyond that we need that additional support, that's a team that we can lean on for support and for continued in-house training around higher level calls. I do think that with regards to law enforcement, I think it is imperative that officers get the minimal skills of being able to engage with someone who is in active crisis, not necessarily figure out what, mental health issues that they're having, but recognizing that that person is in crisis and how to be able to get that person to a place with coping skills to level down enough to where it doesn't escalate. So instead of like de-escalation, instead of escalation with crisis intervention skills. So I'm a strong proponent of all the officers getting training, and when appropriate, if resources are available. And I guess that goes back to the whole piece about making sure that we are able to allocate resources, is that encourage departments to have a specialized team.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it. Sheriff Clemens, if you could wrap this section, part of our session up for us with your perspectives. I'm going to ask our staff leads if we can hold off on and maybe come back to talking about any changes that you see from the discussion until after we welcome our speakers in and give them an opportunity to present to us. But first, we'll go to Sheriff Clemens.
Thank you, Secretary Hooks. I agree with any type of training that we can give our law enforcement officers as practitioners to give them an opportunity to de-escalate any scenario that happens, but also understand and keeping in mind when that person is going through that mental health crisis at that point, it's already reached a level probably before we even got there. So having a team assembled in your agency to handle that, for us smaller agencies, that would be virtually impossible to do. The training that we're receiving in CIT right now is based upon availability, not based upon funding. So the agencies that are providing this training, we're having to wait periodically throughout the year to try to get our officers in this particular class to fulfill that need for that particular training. Anything that we can do to help and with what this group is coming up with and all the recommendations that are coming forward are great. But we also have to take into consideration that in a moment's notice, all this stuff changes. And how do you prepare for that change is an answer that I don't think that any of us possess at this particular time. So we're working with the skill set, trying to get everybody trained and hopefully to be able to de-escalate, deal with a scenario, but also take into consideration that scenario changes in the blink of an eye. But I appreciate all the work and all the comments that are coming forward and giving everybody an opportunity to see different perspectives on how we can move forward to make things better in our communities and better for our law enforcement agencies who are on the front line. Just take into consideration that anything that we do, and we're talking about a lot of programs and we're talking about a lot of alternatives, just consider the fact that the majority of these calls are still going to fall in the realm of law enforcement responding first. The CIT and the crisis intervention teams, that we use today as we're dealing with IVCs. Give you an example, the IVC process is that you go to the magistrate's office, you fill out that process in front of the magistrate if you have a family doing the IVC, and we're sitting 4, 8, 12, 28 days with a respondent in the hospital waiting for that individual to get medical treatment. I'll give you an example. Here in Richmond County, we dealt with an individual. He was Army veteran going through a serious encounter with his mental stableness. And when we took him to the local facility, this man sat in a facility for 28 days. And when we finally got to the meats and potatoes of trying to get it, the military told us that all of his benefits were expended. How do you expend benefits when this person needs this particular help? So that's when it reverts back and becomes a law enforcement issue, when we don't have these partners in place to do the things that need to be done to take care of these people. But again, what I see on the recommendations is pretty solid. We just need to make sure that we understand that some of this training does not require funding that needs to be done. And for us, we have not spent one dime on CIT. It's been a process being afforded to us. So thank you for this opportunity to speak.
Thank you, sir. I recognize that those partnerships are critical to anything that we want to accomplish as a society and as a greater community. I want to now turn it back over. We're going to pivot. We're going to our discussion of reinventing public safety and violence prevention programs. And so I am going to turn it back over to Jeff to introduce our guests today and to lead us into the topic for today's discussion. Jeff?
Okay, thank you very much, Secretary Hooks. Yes, so I think we're moving now to item 3 on the agenda, which, as the Secretary said, is our continuing discussion of reinventing public safety today, with a focus on violence prevention programs and other kind of community responses to reduce violence. We do have, I believe, 2 speakers lined up for today, Dawn Blagrove and Dr. Kyle Fisher, although I don't see that Dr. Fisher is on the call with us yet. So maybe that resolves any question about who we ought to start with. And we've asked each of them to just talk for maybe 5 minutes, sort of like Chief Smythe did with us last time, share some perspectives, and then stay to be part of the conversation. So we'll start with Dawn Blagrove. Dawn is an attorney with a degree from North Carolina Central Eagles Law. She has many years of experience representing incarcerated persons as an attorney with North Carolina Prisoners Legal Services. She currently serves as the executive director of Emancipate NC, which is a criminal justice reform organization. And she also teaches criminal justice as an adjunct faculty member at Fayetteville Technical Community College. Ms. Blagrove, I hope I hit the high points. Welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for having me. I think you did hit the high points, but it really isn't. That's not why we're here. I only have a few minutes, so I want to jump right in. As I prepared to talk to the task force or this working group, it occurred to me that I was very troubled by the orientation of this particular topic. And I would be remiss if I did not start with my concerns. I think the fact that the working group that is assigned to examining use of force by law enforcement to also include a component in this particular work group about community violence, to me, speaks directly to the heart of the problem that you are supposed to be trying to fix. To conflate community violence with the use of force by law enforcement comes from, in my opinion, an underlying and incredibly problematic belief system that the reason law enforcement officers use force is directly in response to the violent nature of the person that they are interacting with. I think that, and furthermore, the conversation that I've heard today further grounds me in the belief that this task force that this particular work group needs to be recentered on the conduct of the police and law enforcement, and not on the conduct of other folks that they are interacting with. As professionals, the way you engage with people, individuals, of excessive force should be a conversation that primarily revolves around the behavior of law enforcement. And I've heard very little of that on this call this morning. For example, we talked about diversion courts, and everyone agreed that we should talk to the prosecutors and bring them in on that discussion. But no one here thought that it was important to include public defenders in a discussion about diversion programs. Again, that speaks to where you are centered, and it speaks to where you are rooted. If you are not willing to have a real conversation about excessive force and the elements within law enforcement, not without law enforcement, but within law enforcement that create culture that promotes excessive force, the task group is, in my opinion, this particular work group is deeply off-center. So I have prepared some notes. I'm going to try to go through them quickly. Just to give you an idea of some of the concern that I have about the orientation of this work group. And I have a document that I prepared that I will share with you all that has footnotes and reference materials that go back, that speak directly to the things that I'm going to talk about. But ultimately, what I want to say is this: law enforcement has to address the real issues within law enforcement and its use of force. A research paper that looked specifically at the Chicago Police Department found that police officers use force against Black citizens on an average, on a higher average than race, even though Black citizens tend to exercise less resistance than white people. That in situations where white people offer resistance, even when that resistance is excessive, law enforcement is still able to alternative means to resolve that situation without reverting to deadly force. And somewhere in the neighborhood of 46% of those cases. Whereas conversely, when dealing with Black citizens who are showing restraint, somewhere in the neighborhood of 28 of those situations end up or are dealt with without excessive or abusive force or deadly force. So let's be clear about what we're talking about here. And I really think it's important for us to reorient ourselves to what the problem is. The problem is not the people. The problem is not the people. The problem is not training, because statistics show that law enforcement officers are able to use huge amounts of discretion with white people who are being resisting and who are acting out violently. Unless we are willing to have the real conversation about what is driving excessive use of force, which I'm not hearing here today, I don't ever think we get to the problem. Second, the Black community is much less likely to call the police after there has been excessive use of force displays in their community. What that means that until you get to the heart and root out the things that make law enforcement officers respond more excessively with violence to Black community members than to other community members, you are exacerbating the problem of community violence. Because when there is no trust in the community for law enforcement, what statistics and research shows is that community stops calling law enforcement. There's a lack of trust issue here that speaks directly to the use of force that we're seeing in our communities. And that lack of trust, again, needs, and again, to even contemplate what that means, you have to root yourself in the reality that the problem is not the people. The problem is within law enforcement and its orientation. Second, or lastly, building on that last, police do not have at this point the capital, the trust capital to make Black communities safe and to diminish community violence. Therefore, I would propose very stringently that in the alternative, we find other means outside of law enforcement to get to the root of violence and not be reactionary instead of being be proactive. I've heard lots and lots of conversation here this morning about funding. Law enforcement agencies across this state are funded at a higher rate than any other line item on most city and county budgets. There's money. The problem is not whether or not you have money. The problem is whether or not you prioritize the need within your department and agencies to root out the cultural causes of excessive force. What I've heard here today is that there is not that will. There's plenty of money for all of this training, for all of these resources, if we cut the fat within law enforcement agencies. This is supposed to be a task force working group dedicated to reimagining. But what I've heard here for the last hour and a half is incredible resistance to change, which makes me wonder if we understand what reimagining actually means. Reimagining should mean that we are open to new ideas, open to alternatives that maybe don't include law enforcement at all. Before I leave, I want to just mention a couple of things that I heard during the discussion and speak directly to them. I heard one officer, Garten, speak about how as law enforcement officers, it is not important. It's not important to his job. It is not integral to his job to know what kind of mental health issue a person is dealing with when they arrive at the scene. Now, to be fair, I understand completely, and I think it is absolutely irresponsible for law enforcement to be the de facto mental health system. But because of the way funding has been dispersed in our country and in our cities and in our municipalities, that has become, to that end, we all know that that is the reality. So as we reimagine, either we take money away from law enforcement and invest it in the community resources that can be proactive in addressing mental health issues, or law enforcement needs to take seriously mental health and commit themselves to investing into understanding what it is that they're looking at when they are responding. If one of those two things is not an option, then we're not really talking about reimagining anything.
Ms. Blagro, I'm going to allow an additional 2 minutes for you based on our timing today. And so, but I'll give you some additional time.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Next, one of their panelists talked about the fact that law enforcement officers cannot make discretionary references or discretionary referrals to diversion programs because maybe the person that they're dealing with has assaulted them and they may be emotional and angry with that individual. Again, if that is something that you are seeing in your officers who are supposed to be professional and objective in their work, that officer is ill-equipped to be in the profession. I am an attorney. I represent criminal defendants. It is part of my ethical oath to remain objective when I deal with my clients and as a professional. If a law enforcement officer wants to be considered a professional, but then also tells me that you cannot extirpate your personal emotions from executing your job as a professional, that person is ill-equipped and ill-fit to be a law enforcement. Again, that speaks directly to the orientation of what I've heard from this working group, and why I am so incredibly disturbed by why I'm hearing here.
All right. We thank you for your perspectives. I, as the chair, am going to invite you that if you have additional information in our practice, please feel free to provide it to our staff leads. They will continue to share the information, because in the essence of time, sometimes everybody doesn't get their full say before us, and we welcome that. We also do welcome the idea of varying perspectives, but I do also want to level set back for the task force. We do not attack other task force members. We respect all positions of task force members and speakers, and we will continue to do so. It's free to agree with this speaker or disagree with the speaker, but we're going to move forward collaboratively and as a team. I will say that maybe to the benefit of our speaker, our agenda today did not focus on the use of force. That was another day for agenda items. And so we have vetted those. So I understand that what you may not have heard today may have not been to your liking, but this agenda was not centered around use of force. So with that, I'm going to turn to our Mr. Welty to introduce our next speaker for his perspectives. And Jeff and Greg, if you would also be mindful of the time as well and help me with that regard too. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Secretary Hooks. Our second speaker for today is Dr. Kyle Fisher. Dr. Fisher is an MD and a practicing emergency room physician in the state of Maryland. He also serves as the policy director for the Health Alliance for Violence Intervention, which is a national organization focused on the work of hospital-based violence interruption or violence prevention programs. Members of the working group will recall that you had some materials in your pre-reading about those programs, and Dr. Fisher is here to talk for 5 to 8 minutes about the work of his organization and the work of those programs, and then hopefully we'll be able to stay for the working group conversation that follows. Dr. Fisher, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the time. I apologize for our executive director, Fatima. She was going to join today, but as it turns out, our annual conference starts in about an hour and she got pulled away, as you might imagine. I'm going to quick share my screen here to show you a little bit of slides in a graphical form so that we can talk about what we do as an organization, and I'll try and be quick, 5 to 8 minutes. So we are the Health Alliance for Violence Intervention, and we represent hospital-based violence intervention programs around the country. We were founded in 2009, and to date we have 40 member programs across the country, including internationally as well. In London, we have a program in Canada, and there are 30 programs that are new and emerging and are not quite at the membership status, but are operational and getting started as we speak. We really view violence through a public health approach and a patient-centered approach. We know that in America, Black Americans are 10 times more likely to die from gun violence, and it's the leading cause of death in young Black men aged 15 to 34. And, unfortunately, we also know from decades of research that one of the biggest risk factors for someone being injured violently, be it a gunshot wound, stab wound, assault, is if you've ever been injured before. And there are tremendous costs to this, both to the patients, the health system, society in general, in terms of lost wages, tax dollars, criminal justice costs. So this is something that affects all layers of society. What we do is we have a model that we identify those patients that are most at risk of being violently injured, with that marker of if you've been injured. So we meet people in the hospital or shortly thereafter. At that critical moment while they're there, we work on safety planning, de-escalation if need be, and doing all sorts of treatment to ensure they get the trauma-informed care to best heal in the best way that they can. So you can see we start on the top right with that brief intervention. We continue the care in the hospital, and upon discharge, we follow up patients after discharge for 6 months to a year. And then we really go upstream to treat the social determinants of health, things like housing, victims of service compensation, safety planning, jobs, legal advocacy, transportation. We do a comprehensive needs assessment, and the best way to say it is whatever a patient needs to best recover and stay safe, that's what we give them. There's no cookie cutter approach to it. Every patient has a slightly different set of needs. In order to do this, we have a team-based approach that works generally with hospitals or in the community and associated with hospitals. So not everything has to be employed directly in the healthcare service. We have lots of organizations that have MOUs with hospitals and can work in link together. So generally, if you look at this graph, you'll see that it's a team with a medical director, but intervention specialists, which are the most important members of the team that are working with the patients in and outside of the hospital. And then other things like other people like social workers, psychologists, and mental health specialists, and a variety of other team members. But I will say that these violence intervention specialists are really the most important members of the team. These people tend to play a role of mentors, case managers, peer support specialists, and they are the #1 contact for these individuals to help guide them through their recovery and to help keep them healthy, safe, happy, and make sure they're getting the needs that they get. We know that the healthcare system is very difficult to interact with. I'm a doctor and I know that. I'll admit that our systems are difficult. And so that these patients are really the best contact between the healthcare system, the legal system, social services system to help interact and get people what they need. And some people ask why intervene at the hospital. Well, we have noted both in practice and research that this is actually a very good time to intervene and interact with people. The good analogy is if you think of when people have heart attacks. So if you have a heart attack, it turns out that's the best time that you can get someone to quit smoking, because something big has happened in their life. They're reflective of what happened before, what's happening now, what's happening later. And that's when they're open towards different services and things that might help. And it's the same thing with violence prevention. So like I said, we do pre and post-discharge support. And we have worked for a number of years to get official designation through the United States CMS and the National Uniforms Claims Committee to get designation as official healthcare providers for these folks that are doing this critical work. So you're asking the question, does this work? We've got a handful of randomized controlled trials, as well as lots of other longitudinal studies. These are 3 of the biggest, one out of Baltimore, one out of Chicago, one out of Richmond, Virginia, that shows pretty convincingly that one, if you look at if we don't do anything, there's a high likelihood that people will get re-injured. But if we do intervene, those numbers are cut down significantly. So 5% in Dr. Cooper's study, 8% in Dr. Zun's, and 5.6 in Dr. Apatano's. You'll notice that 3rd trial on the right, the results aren't as striking as the others. I could get into the details of that trial, but there are some issues with the way it was designed, but it's a bigger conversation. There are also other findings in the research that show bigger societal benefits. So in Baltimore, the patients that were injured were less likely to be convicted later of a violent crime, less likely to retaliate against people that injured them. So it saved $1.25 million in incarceration costs. At the same time, we were able to get people employment. So they're four times more likely to be employed. In Chicago, there was a decrease in re-injury. And then the program in Virginia also showed that as people were recovering from their injuries, and as we know is almost the norm of getting shot, suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, there was a decrease in alcohol and drug use, so likely from less self-treatment of those symptoms. I'll leave it at that because I know we have a very brief time period, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have, and thank you for having us today.
Thank you, Doctor. We also thank you for pinch hitting and bringing this to us today. Both our speakers remain with us, so if there's a working group member that while you're expressing your thoughts on today's conversation, on today's agenda, if you have a question of them, you can ask that question of them as well. And so I'd like to start with any one of our task force members who if you just raise your hand, it's easier for me than the raise hand feature. If you just let me know on the screen or just jump in, glad to hear from you.
Secretary Hooks.
Yes, sir.
I just want to make a point of clarification because I do speak for the Raleigh Police Department in a sense on this task force. I want to make sure that my comments were not misunderstood by the task force members. When I talk about mental illness, and I spoke about not being overly concerned with what that particular diagnosis is, my stance was that I was not caring about not knowing. What I was saying was what's important is the fact that the officer recognizes that there is a crisis. Doesn't matter if it's a crisis due to one particular mental illness over the other. The fact is that you have to recognize that there's a crisis before you can address it. So when you speak to that, what I'm speaking to is understanding that there is a crisis taking place, not necessarily being a master or understanding every facet that goes along with every branch of mental illness. Recognizing the crisis, offering the appropriate services for that crisis, not necessarily knowing every mental illness there is. And I think there was one other question that the first presenter spoke to, something I said directly, which was as it relates to being emotionally involved. Police officers are human beings asked to do extraordinary things. Simple as that. Everybody's emotional. I don't know when the last time she went to work and got punched in the face or spit on or bitten, but to ask an officer to then turn around and place somebody in a diversion program for that particular assault. And I also mentioned the fact that there's the possibility of having that emotion with the victim itself, the victims themselves being there, which may also influence the determination to go diversion or not. So what I'm saying is if we're going to be honest, then we have to have the floor to be honest. And then we have to be able to speak and be honest without being beat up on for being honest. So yes, I'm saying police officers do get emotional. They do. So therefore we have to have other avenues for these diversions to take place, not putting my head in and saying we're robots and we can't ever be emotional. That's ridiculous.
Thank you, Sergeant. I certainly know police officers can be emotional, victims can be emotional, suspects can be emotional, attorneys can be emotional. And we'd be less than honest and disingenuous with each other if we were not. I see Ms. Maxwell. I saw her hand raised. Ms. Maxwell, I'd like to recognize you, ma'am.
Secretary Hooks, I'd like to thank both of the speakers. I'm sorry, I wasn't sure. Did you say the program was in North Carolina for Kyle Fisher? I was trying to pay attention.
So right now, I believe we have a couple of institutions that have started preliminarily thinking about starting hospital-based violence intervention programs in North Carolina, but we don't have any member programs established yet.
Well, are you at liberty to share with whoever contacted you, the ones that are thinking of it in North Carolina, so we could have an idea? Or
what I'd love to do is let me get back to, I'll ask our training and technical assistance team because they keep the records of all of that, and we can have them certainly respond back to you so that I know that it's the right people.
Okay.
I want to say it's Duke, but I could be wrong.
All right. Okay. And to Attorney Blagrove, thank you for speaking truth to power. And to all who are here, that is why all local governmental, especially law enforcement, have an employee assistance program. When you feel stressed out or out, that's what that program is for. I believe it doesn't penalize your sick hours or whatever, because everyone gets stressed. I'm a retired social worker and I've been bitten at and I've been spit at also. And I did every home visit without a police patrol. And I'm here today. I'm the only governmental person drawing a pension on this program right now, I believe. But remember that we're trying to eradicate years of inequities in a short time. We aren't going to accomplish it all, but we have to just think of the individual. And if you look like me, you know somebody who was in your family that was wrongly stopped, wrongly arrested, because these inequities existed. Remember, the main premise was to catch people who were runaway slaves for a lot of these programs that were in existence that are in existence now. So please put this aside and work together for the brothers and sisters out here who need a change. That's why the governor had the foresight to make an Andrea Harris task force to complement, because changing the criminal justice system is not going to fit it, because both systems need to be changed at one time. And I think everyone who's here, but we have to make a change.
If I could respond to Miss Maxwell and say thank you, I appreciate your comments, and I would also like to say that I have actually been as a criminal defense attorney spit at, cussed at, had ejaculations thrown at me from my clients. But it is still my job to objectively represent them. And if I am not able to do that, then I will be disbarred. I appreciate that that it may have felt like personal attacks because I referenced the individual that made the point. But I think if you were listening with an open mind and a critical ear, you would have heard that I addressed issues and things that were spoken and was not disparaging to any particular individual. But once again, I do want to double down on the fact that as professionals, it is our job to act professional. And if you find that you are unable to remove your emotions from your work in a way that is unnecessarily impactful to your client base, that is a red flag.
Thank you, ma'am. I also would like to thank both of our speakers for their input and recognizing that we have time. And Mr. Fisher, if you have additional information that you could provide to our staff leads too, and I know we were short on time for both of you, feel free. I think I may have been remiss in making that offer to you. And thank you again, Ms. Maxwell. Your perspective and wisdom always adds a lot to every endeavor that we've engaged in. Mr. Wells, I'd like to solicit your thoughts.
Thank you. I guess my main question for both Mr. Fisher and Attorney Blagrove is, or Dr. Fisher, is just if you have a specific recommendations for this task force, Dr. Bergove, we've talked about use of force in several of our previous meetings. And so that wasn't as much the earlier topic, but I definitely heard you that we need to be hearing from public defenders and other voices. And if you have any specific other suggestions around voices that we definitely need to be engaging in, I would appreciate that, as well as just any specific recommendations either today or at a later date related to use of force and police interactions with the community. I think that would be helpful. And Dr. Fisher, same with you. And also, I guess I just had a question about the cure violence model, and are y'all related to that? But just any specific recommendations you have for us as we, because unfortunately we've not been given as much time as I think all of us would like to have to make proposals. And so just the more concrete proposals we have, the easier it is for us to sort of run with those and make decisions. Thank you. And thank you both for your presentations today.
Thank you, sir. Sheriff Clemens, I see you went off camera for a bit. Would you like to weigh in on this topic? He may have needed to step away for a minute. Chief Letney, are you?
Very briefly answer the cure violence question if you'd like.
Yes, go ahead, Mr.
Okay, so cure violence for folks is a community violence interruption type program that is predominantly located in the community. We work with them and have had a long relationship with them. And we view both of our work as a spectrum of, working from the hospital to the community. So there are, we have some programs that are in the hospital and predominantly in the hospital, but don't do as much community interruption work. But we do have some that do both. And alternatively, Cure Violence has programs that are in the community and then go to the hospital and do some interruption, but they don't do as much of the case management upstream solutions. And in an ideal world, you would have robust systems where you do both. And it's really a spectrum.
I would also like to address the cure violence model because it is one of the recommendations that I had highlighted in my prepared document, which I will share with the committee. But I think one of the things that is most critical about the cure violence model is that it is something that is driven by the community, by community members, and it is proactively designed to step in and assuage violence early, to prevent violence. And the undergirding of Cure Violence, the program, is that the only way you can be proactive in addressing community violence is if you understand and know the people in the community and you have trust of those people. So that was definitely one of the recommendations that I would have. And if funding is an issue, again, I think that that the concern for funding programs like this, where we know that they are successful, they reduce the need for law enforcement interactions in those particular communities. So my suggestion would be that our legislation, our state legislators create omnibus bills around criminal justice that fund more fully program-based alternatives to police interaction. The other alternative that I would suggest is a program in Richmond, California, that is called the Office of Neighborhood Safety, which again is rooted in being proactive, and instead of being reactionary to crime, but being proactive in addressing the things that motivate and drive crime, and addressing those issues proactively, and not by law enforcement, but by people who have trust of those folks in those individual communities so that they can intervene early. before situations escalate to a point where they are unable to be de-escalated. Lastly, I would suggest that what we have seen in cities like Philadelphia, Boston, New York is a sort of quasi judicial body that is created called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which we saw used in South Africa to help reconcile the trauma that Black and brown people have and poor people have because of over-policing and because of the historical relationship between law enforcement and the community. I think it is really important when you talk about what causes trauma to understand, or what causes violence to understand that so much of it is driven by untreated trauma. And I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions could be a way for individuals in the community who have been traumatized by law enforcement to be able to hold them directly accountable, and the individual who harmed them directly accountable, to have their issues heard and to have them recognized. And ultimately, what research shows is that you find that once you treat that underlying trauma, there is a decline in interpersonal violence. So those would be my concrete recommendations.
Thank you. And I'll just say any links or resources y'all have would be super helpful. I will just stick up for the law enforcement on this task force and just say how appreciative I've been throughout this process of how engaged they've been, and really being able to share openly about this critical topic that it is really about human rights, about the lives of everyone involved, and that you know, and how seriously everyone is taking this. And same with you, Ms. Lagrove. I really appreciate your openness and your passion around this, and your just how deeply this is of critical importance to you as it is to all of us. So thank you to each of you. Thank you, Secretary.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Sheriff Clemens, you've heard the discussions. I'd like to hear your perspectives as we go around the group.
I'd just like to say that taking in consideration everyone's point, that's what this group is about. There is certainly a time and a place to where we have to be able to respect each other's opinions, be able to agree or disagree, and we've heard some of that today. And there's nothing wrong with passion. Passion moves the wheel. I would not want to be on a group where everybody's just sitting here ho-hum. I like the spirited comments because we all learn something from that. We all take something back. But let me also remind us that as we deal with the issues of law enforcement and the use of deadly force and changing the culture, we also have to work on the culture of our communities also. Because in order to build that trust back in the community, we have to trust in them, they have to trust in us, and it is a team effort. And the only way that we can change anything systematically or anywhere else is we have to work together regardless of the circumstances and understand. But the one thing that I have not heard today or in any of our conversations when we talk about over policing, understand that we're not just riding around in the communities, jumping out of our cars, chasing individuals. It has been a situation where it has been call driven, and we're trying to get to a point where we're encouraging our agencies to be more proactive than call driven. It's just like going to the doctor's office. Would you rather go to the doctor's office and understand how and that's the thing that we as leaders in our communities and leaders in law enforcement are trying to teach our younger officers and change the mindset of our older officers, the community police. They're not flocking to our doors and kicking them down, wanting to be law enforcement officers. And a part of our community's culture is when mom and dad and grandma's in the store, first thing they see when they see a law enforcement officer is, you better be good or I'm going to call that law enforcement officer. Well, that works with that psyche and that mindset of that individual in our communities also. So we have to be mindful of so many things that we have to deal with these social ills that we're dealing with. But I agree, that law enforcement and those that are involved in deadly force in those situations, y'all heard me say it before, that we should not have two justices. It should be one justice for all people, and that's where we should be. And these are the things that we have to work forward to. But again, I love this group. I love the opportunity to listen and learn. And sometimes I speak up, sometimes I don't. But trust me, I got my book here. I'm writing down and I'm learning every time you folks speak. Kerwin, I will say for what you do and what you bring to this table, and for all of the others that see where we are. And Secretary Hooks, your leadership in this scenario is great. And Miss Deborah Maxwell down there in New Hanover County, I'm a young man of Brunswick County, so I'm just a rock throw across the river from you. So it's good seeing you too. So thank you, Secretary Hooks, for an opportunity to speak again.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. Pittman, Sheriff recognized you in his comments and bringing some thoughts that have broadened people's minds and scope to the table. So I'd like to open it up to you, sir.
First, I'd like to thank our two speakers. This has been an amazing meeting, and it's going to take these hard conversations for us to move the needle forward to reimagine public safety in all totalities. And so I don't know if I may have missed it or we may have just tailored over it, the community policing aspects in regards to the agenda. And I may have missed it, but if I did, I had one comment particularly tailored toward that slate with regards to the recommendation. And it came to when we was talking about the liaison and when we said trusted, and it was added in credible liaisons. So I have a problem particularly with us labeling individuals credible or not, because now that boils down to the point of who is validating their credibility. And so it seems that law enforcement within that particular recommendation will be validating individuals from the community's credibility. And this right here will be ultimately problematic in small and rural areas in which individuals in the community are already over-policed. And so this will discredit them from even being added as a liaison. And so I ask that we please remove the credible part from that recommendation and just have trusted liaisons within their respective community, because to allow somebody to say if they're credible or not is extremely problematic. Now, to move on to the current topic that we're on, restorative justice practices needs to be more highlighted and funded within our communities and initiated within communities. So maybe we can create some type of structure for these rural areas to have some type of restorative justice practices and models for them to look after will be great. Grassroots grassroots programs need to be funded. We know and understand that when it comes to violence on violence, individuals are not going to flock to law enforcement to solve this type of violence. It will be extremely hard to get two gang members who are rivals with each other in the room with law enforcement, let alone each other, but to sit down with law enforcement and hash out their problems. So when it comes to this particular section, we have to reimagine this without law enforcement and without law enforcement in the picture. And so that's why I say funding for these grassroots programs who are out here doing the boots on the ground work and who are actually making a change, but yet do not possess the capital to expand their vision and help more people. So this is what we must focus on, as well as create post-support incentives for grassroots orgs, meaning wraparound services. So if somebody has been shot, we need to highlight or maybe create some type of structure for individuals within particular organizations to get into this field to provide this wraparound supportive role after individual have been shot, to say, okay, well now we see you have been shot and you've been through the stresses of being shot. Is this the alternative that you want to lead? Is this the lifestyle that you want to lead? Individuals, as we've seen from statistics, majority of them are young, so that means their minds are still malleable, which means we still have time to save them. So that's why we should provide these wraparound services with incentives for organizations who are grassroots on the ground to participate in these wraparound supportive services. Another thing, we must create structures for these communities to have neutral meetings, meaning like I specified earlier, without law enforcement, but we have to create these type of structures in order these models to say this could be implemented within your community. We have to do that. Another thing, the exchange from earlier was great. And it made me think with Mr. Gardner being honest and we being openly honest, that of another recommendation that may not particularly fit into this particular piece right here, but it sure will fit into the use of force policy. And that is after a certain amount of complaints, individuals, law enforcement should be required to take psychological evaluations and stress evaluations. This is of utmost importance, that a piece that we're missing, that we have to put these type of provisions in place and try to be proactive instead of being reactive after something has occurred. But thank you. I'm not going to take up much of the time. This was a great discussion. And Miss Attorney Blagrove, if you could please look over some more of our recommendations and some more of our material, and please send your thoughts and email your thoughts to us. It will be greatly appreciated. And thank you to both our speakers.
Thank you, sir. And I think Mr. Pittman has given life to some of the very things that Dr. Fisher talked about, the opportunity to engage with individuals at the hospitals. And so I think that's important as well. And so from a community perspective and moving forward in communities, I think all of these discussions are helpful as we move forward. Let me go to Ms. Angelica Wynn for your perspectives, and then I will go to another. Chief Letney is back on with us, to him after Ms. Wynn. So Ms. Wynn.
Great, thank you. I want to thank both of the speakers. I want to echo some of the sentiments that have already been made around the passion in the room. And I think that I think that the passion is what leads us here. Our commitment to shifting to something different is what leads us here and continues to lead us here. And I want to thank particularly Attorney Blagrove, because one of the things that particularly resonates with me is how do we, when we talk about our work and how we approach this work group, what really resonated to me, or what I heard, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but what I heard was, let's start with a yes, or let's not impede ourselves and hold ourselves back on solutions that they don't necessarily fall within line of what we've seen in the past. And I like that, because it allows us to be more creative, and because if we start from the no, it can't happen, then we certainly are limiting ourselves. But if we start with the yes, let's say, well, maybe this could happen in our community, and then it gets us on track to seeing if it is actually a positive, like something that's possible happening in our community. But if we start already from the no of why it can't happen, I think it certainly limits us. I am very grateful to this passionate group, and I do think it is going to require trust and vulnerability, and part of building the vulnerability is also having these hard conversations and saying these difficult things, and also recognizing that we really are talking about systems and not necessarily individuals, because that's what I've heard all day today, that we're really looking at systems and how they can change, recognizing where there is certainly a lot of room for growth, but also recognizing that there's some pieces that are actually working at this time. And the last thing is I want to say is I really appreciate the intervention strategies at the hospital, but at the end of the day, I would be remiss if I don't talk about this piece of prevention. Like how do we invest in communities around where violence doesn't happen to begin with? I think earlier in these works groups, I had mentioned this piece of some folks in Davis, California, who are having conversations around public safety, but more particular in identifying the social determinants of public safety. There's an idea that public safety equates law enforcement, and that's not always the case. In fact, that's probably just a little small slither of the big public safety pie. And so I think I would be remiss if I don't say that, and it may be that the Andrea Harris Task Force is working on these pieces, but we cannot fail to mention or be cognizant of the fact that there has to be a reinvestment in communities as it relates to joblessness, homelessness, housing, food insecurity, all these pieces, all these social determinants that do impact public safety. I think that work that we're doing right now is great. It's hard, but we're being steadfast around it. But there's these other components of reinvesting in the communities, and also with the frame of mind that communities know what they need best, and that they have to be a part of all these conversations, and that their voice are integral to the work that we do.
Thank you, ma'am. Points well taken. I think that all of the discussions and the issues of the day should serve to broaden our perspectives about what public safety is. Public safety certainly is not law enforcement. I can tell you that from where I sit as the Secretary of Public safety is also about great public health in a pandemic and supporting those structures that encourage people to care for each other so that we can stamp out the virus. It's also about when a natural disaster strikes and mobilizing police forces, sheriff forces, the National Guard, the emergency management to protect and save and communities that may be in danger and individuals' lives. So I do think that it's a great level set by you to broaden that thought process and that scope, and I welcome that to that discussion. And let me turn to Chief Letney and then back to our leads before we wrap up today. But do let me address Mr. Pittman. You didn't miss anything. It's just so that we could give some time to our speakers that we didn't go back into some of those recommendations right there, and because we were already limited with time with them, and I wanted to give them the airtime that they needed to talk to us. Chief Letney.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and my apologies for having to jump off. I got an emergency phone call I had to take. So I came back in right when Sheriff Clemens was starting to speak, and so I missed the beginning of the conversation and the context, but I have to say I do agree with the Sheriff and his perspective, and also Ms. Wind and hers. We have talked in many of our other work group meetings in depth about use of force, in depth about societal issues, and in depth about the social determinants of crime. Why are law enforcement officers interacting with the public in the first place, other than those positive relationships and positive interactions that we try to ensure we have? Why are we getting the 911 calls? Why is there violence? And why are we the solution to that? And I think as we've talked about, in some measure, it's because of the failures of the other systems of housing, of education, of mental health, of social services, of all of those things that either didn't have an opportunity or missed an opportunity, that as a result, it turns into some community public safety law enforcement type of issue and or response. So to the extent we can collaborate and shore up those systems to get people the help, the services, the opportunities they need to be successful, then we don't have a law enforcement interaction, or the ones we do will be more positive. So I agree with all of that. I think it's a little outside the scope of what this work group is talking about, particularly in this agenda, but very important conversations and very important part of what the task force, I hope, will coalesce from all of the work groups and all the conversations we've had for these many months.
Thank you, Chief. We are rounding out our time, and so I would welcome, I don't know if they're able to still listen in, Madam Justice Earls and Attorney General Stein. You've heard these robust discussions today, and you've heard our other agenda meetings. We welcome your input before we close out.
Well, in light of the shortness of time, rather than commenting generally, let me just say I did have some specific suggestions to a couple of the recommendations that I sent by email. So I'll just follow up on those. But I wanted to let everyone know I was paying attention to that. But as always, I'm enormously grateful to our presenters and to the work that this group is doing. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Attorney General. He may have had to step away from his microphone. Let me turn to our substantive leads that have been working through the recommendations. First, let me go Jeff Welty, and then Jasmine, if you're still here with us as well, either one of you.
Yep, thank you, Secretary Hooks. Interesting discussion today. I think for us as staff, a next step would be to try to generate some kind of possible recommendations to take the group's temperature on, similar to perhaps what we did with the community policing stuff, which I'm sure we'll get back to at a later meeting and drive that forward. So to help us do that, if folks on this call have specific suggestions for possible recommendations for the group to consider, if you would just let us know by email or give us a phone call or whatever, that would help us to generate a list of kind of candidate recommendations to take the group's temperature on. And I think that would help us get from this very interesting conversation to perhaps some kind of tangible possible action items or recommendations for the report for the group.
Thank you, sir. Jasmine?
The only thing that I would add is in response to Kerwin's comments that reminding the group that you all had an early intervention recommendation that had some of the pieces of what Kerwin was talking about that is prepared to go soon to the task force for a straw poll. And I also understand that Working Group 1 in their accountability days is very interested in further talking about early intervention for use of force. And so that psychological piece that you mentioned, I think was not explicitly included in what you all internally voted on, but could be added at later iterations of that recommendation. So I wanted to say that's on the table.
Thank you, ma'am. I know that there's never enough time to cover everything, but Greg and Ellen, have we missed anything as far as being able to wrap today's meeting up?
I don't have anything to add. Thanks, Secretary. Or just a thank you to everyone for responding to all the surveys and emails I've been sending you.
Yes, and I was just going to quickly say that we will have a new round of straw poll surveys going out to you guys this week. Two of the your recommendations will be in there, but there will also be recommendations for y'all to vote on from Working Group 1 and Working Group 3. So please complete those so you can have your voices heard, and it will be the same format where you can make comments and vote yes or no. Hopefully that looks familiar and you guys can get that done this week. So thank you all.
All right. And so with that, I will end it for today. I want to thank you all for your time and attention. It's always an opportunity to sit together in collaboration. Collaboration doesn't mean you agree on everything down the line, but it's vitally important that everybody comes to the table, that we not only bring our perspectives, but we take perspectives as well. And so I'm very grateful for all the work that continues to go on. I trust the members of this task force. I trust the chairs of this task force, and I'm thankful for the work that this working group is doing. And so with that, I will sign off for today, and we look forward to the interactions as we prepare for the next task force meeting. Thank you.
Thank you all.